Okay, so I want to thank again Philippe and Brett and the scientific committee for inviting me to this really fascinating symposium. It's been a really great collection of talks today, and I realize that I now stand between you and getting out into this beautiful Paris evening. So I'll try to be snappy. And I was asked to do this overview of medical anthropology of food and nutrition across history and of human evolution, and I have found that there have been quite a few connections. Some of what I'm going to say today has already been said in more detailed ways. So I'll just begin by talking about our current understanding of the evolution and history of human diet, and looking at it very much from a biocultural perspective. And then think about some of those implications of changing diet for the human gut microbiome. I then want to look at some lessons from medical anthropology and nutritional anthropology and really consider social class, gender, and food insecurity, which I think is really important going forward when we think about doing this research on the microbiome. And then I'm going to finish by talking about a study that I'm currently involved in called Mothers to Babies. And it's looking at pregnancy diet and the microbiome to try to break that transmission of the transgenerational transmission of non-communicable diseases, or what we also call chronic diseases, particularly those that are diet-related. So we begin in the Paleolithic, of course, so we're thinking about our hominin ancestors and what did they eat. And of course, this is the introduction, this Paleolithic period of the genus Homo. And so, of course, we want to understand the evolution of Homo, our hominin ancestors, and think about their diets. But we've also really been interested in their diets because of thinking about many of the nutritional dilemmas and diseases that we now experience in the 21st century, beginning in the 20th century. And so the work of researchers to look at the Paleolithic prescription has been, I think, really influential in the way we think about these diseases that we experience. This was first popularized by Dr. Cordain in his book, The Paleo Diet. And it's premised on this idea, this mismatch hypothesis, this idea that we evolved, for the most part, most of our human evolution took place in the Paleolithic period as hunter-gatherers, foragers, and that somehow we are now, after agricultural revolution, we're stuck with our genome, our Paleolithic genome, our genotype and phenotype, and so that we're now experiencing all of these diseases because of that. This research was done in a more serious vein in 1985 by Eden and Connor, with their influential Paleolithic nutrition article. And what they did really was take the data that many anthropologists had collected through the 20th century on hunter-gatherer diets, and they amalgamated it all into one sort of essentialized Paleolithic diet, which they characterized as being 35% meat and 65% vegetable or plant foods. And so they made a number of comparisons between the Paleolithic diet and current American diet. I'll just draw your attention to a couple of them. The first is, of course, the much lower amount of fat as a contribution to the total dietary energy in the Paleolithic diet compared to the current American diet. And the much higher amount, more than double, the amount of fiber in the late Paleolithic diet compared to the current American diet. And I'll come back to that, of course, as we talk about the effects of diet on the microbiome. So I just want to draw your attention to be mindful of the problems of trying to characterize the one Paleolithic diet. So this diagram here shows you 4 different examples of hunter-gatherer diets, And I just want to make the point here that they're quite variable in terms of particularly their meat versus vegetable foods. Obviously, the Inuit diet of the Canadian Arctic, which is a much, this would be a traditional diet, of course, pre-contact, had almost complete meat in the diet, and fish as well, and marine mammals, compared to the Kungsan of the Kalahari Desert, who had much higher content of plant foods compared to meat. So again, just we need to be really careful that we remember that variability even within the Paleolithic diet. The next big sort of event in our tour of the human evolution and changing diet is of course cooking, which is unique to humans. And if you subscribe to Richard Wrangham's hypothesis in his book Catching Fire, he argues that this might have been a very important driver of hominin evolution. And he argues that, in fact, it goes as far back as Homo erectus. So with cooking, of course, you get a more energy from food, and that food, of course, as we heard this morning, there was an increase in meat, but also important contribution of cooking to tubers and roots, which would release more energy, and particularly important would be to decrease the amount of energy that's needed for digestion of the food. So obviously foods are more digestible. And Wrangham argues there's a number of morphological changes that happen with Homo erectus, one of the most important pieces being the expansion of the brain, which we see, of course, with Homo sapiens as well. And so Wrangham argues that that brain expansion required much more energy because, of course, a bigger brain requires more resting energy allocated to it, and allowed for a decrease in the energy going to digestion. And that also affected the decrease in the size of the rib cage, the smaller teeth, et cetera, smaller jaw. So quite a few changes going on there with cooking. The next big step or change in diet, of course, is the agricultural revolution. And here we can see the earliest cultivation of domesticated plants in the Near East, and all different dates all around the world independently happening. The main change here, though, is the qualitative change in the diet. So we see much more reliance on cereal grains, and we see, of course, as well, the change in the domesticated animals as well. With domesticated animals, you have a much higher fat content compared to wild game. So we're seeing this qualitative change, certainly with agriculture. Along with agriculture, for some people in the world came the establishment of dairy farming. And human genetic evidence indicates that there was a selective sweep happening in Northern Europe, Western Africa, and parts of South Asia, Southeast Asia, where you see that the ability of populations to produce the enzyme lactase past infancy. So as you know, of course, most humans do not produce lactase after infancy, it was with these particular populations that did engage in dairy farming that you see that mutation and an advantage to be able to digest lactose, the main sugar in milk, with that continual production of lactase through the life course, also known as lactase persistence. But just a reminder, of course, this is a minority of the world. Most of the world does not have that ability to produce lactase. Similar story can be seen with evolving genomes after the agricultural revolution, with the ability to digest starch more effectively. And this research has compared populations with high starch diets in the gray bars and the gray lines versus populations or groups with low starch diets. And as you can see, the gene AMY1, which produces or codes for the production of amylase, which is the starch in the oral microbiome that is able to digest starch more easily, is much higher in gene copy number for those high starch diets compared to the low starch diets. So these examples of both lactose digestion and starch digestion show that we really have evolved genetically since the rise of agriculture, and so that mismatch hypothesis really doesn't hold. And further, we know that we have this ability to adapt to dietary change, and that has also been helped through those host microbe symbiosis. So we know there are a number of microbes which are very helpful in terms of the digestion of various carbohydrates, proteins, that allow us to have these nutrients more bioavailable, and also, of course, signal things to change the metabolism as well. So I want to just be mindful as well, if we think about the changing diet, we also have to think about this concept of local biologies, which Margaret Locke developed through the late 80s and has continued to be a really fundamental concept in medical anthropology. And I extend that by thinking about local diets and local microbiomes. Really lovely example of this idea of local diets and local microbiomes is the example of research that was done by Haim and colleagues published in 2010, where they were looking at the enzyme pyrifranases, which are able to effectively digest seaweed or nori, commonly associated with sushi. And what they found was that the marine bacteria that was on the nori and was ingested by humans actually transferred genes rather to bacterium in the human gut. And what they found was that they could identify those enzymes in a Japanese group, at least some of the Japanese individuals that they looked at, but could not find it in any of the American individuals that they looked at. So a very nice example of that dietary adaptation and how localized it can be. Okay, so the latest evolution in the human diet is, of course, what I'm calling the industrial diet. And in my opinion, this is probably the most profound change that we've seen in our diet so far. It's obviously quite recent, and if you subscribe to Anthony Winston's schemata, he argues that it began in the 1870s with food patents and really ramped up in the mid-20th century with the addition of macroadulterants. And he's talking about here fat, salt, and sugar. Of course, there are many microadulterants as well that we add to our foods: chemical, coloring, preservatives, pesticide residues, etc. And then in the 1980s, we see a real change, a shift with the globalization of the industrial diet with the rise of the transnational food corporations. And there are many things we could talk about in terms of the changes in the industrial diet. I just want to mention, in reference to Martin Blazer's talk earlier about the real huge use of antibiotics in meat production, particularly in the US, where 80% of antibiotics sold are used in animals. And I think we really need to think about how those antibiotics might come through our food system into our bodies. So what are the effects of diet on the microbiome? Well, I think we're just really beginning to try to understand what's going on here. And I just start by pointing out that most of the studies that have been done on this are really using animal models, particularly mice. So we still need human studies, some of the types of studies that Marie Gloria Domingos talked about this morning. And there have been, a number of them now published, trying to do really at a descriptive level the effects of diet on the gut microbiome. David et al. Has been looking at trying to understand whether diet can actually rapidly change the human gut microbiome. And their results really speak to plant versus animal diets as having the most profound effects. And they argue that there is that they do alter quite effectively the human gut microbiome. Certainly, as we heard earlier as well, that probably the two things to look at in terms of those diets are fat and fiber. Although I do think that sugar is going to require some more research as well, and is perhaps much less studied than fat and fiber. So there seem to be a number of studies that are trying to sort of get that descriptive look at hunter-gatherer, agrarian, and industrial diets. And of course, as we heard earlier today, it is looking like the industrial diets in particular are quite different in terms of that diversity or decrease in the diversity of the taxa, the various taxa of microbes. And so that's obviously something we need to consider further. But I think that, again, something we heard earlier is that we really have to think about how much is really happening in that first 1,000 days or birth to 3 years, because there may not be as much we can do in terms of altering the gut microbiome with diet. And so we're really going to have to think about what's happening within those first 3 years. So I'm going to just switch gears here a little bit and talk about some of those lessons from medical anthropology and nutritional anthropology, and thinking about those really important biosocial variables that affect diet. And I'm going to highlight socioeconomic status, a little bit on ethnicity, but focus as well on gender and age, and look at the intersection of all of those. So if we're thinking about age then, again, and connecting back to that first 1,000 days, we really have to think about children's foods. And this is, I'm sure, not the way French children eat, but in North America, we eat a lot of processed foods, and children eat these foods on a daily basis. Very high in fat and sugar, very low in fiber. And so children's diets have changed enormously with industrialization. And I just want to point out that this is not just a North American phenomenon or a recent phenomenon. These are some data that I collected in the 1990s. This was done with old-fashioned epidemiology, with 24-hour dietary recalls, done with children from birth to 60 months or 5 years of age. And their ages are separated out in the different bars in this graph. But I just want to draw your attention to, well, first of all, what was the main staple of Nepali children. And I should point out these were very impoverished families. So these were families that were actually children of carpet workers living in Kathmandu. So mostly over 90% of children were reported to have eaten rice, which you would expect, and lentils, pulses and nuts, but mostly lentils as their main staple. But what we were also finding as well was the introduction of weaning foods, Nestle's Cerelac, and infant formula, Lactogen, which these children were all actually breastfed, so the people were feeding these to them as supplements. And surprisingly, a high number of sweets on a daily basis. Over 70% or 60% of children were reported to eat biscuits, sweet little biscuits bought from corner stores, and puff pastries also commercially sold. So this is definitely a global phenomenon we're seeing. In thinking about social class and ethnicity, I guess a reminder again that these variables have affected human diet for a long time, really ever since the rise of civilizations and after agricultural revolution. And of course, there have been some nutritional disasters linked to socioeconomic status and ethnicity, with things like the Irish potato famine of the 19th century. But a reminder that these socioeconomic differences are still really pervasive today. They profoundly affect our diets. And so just a quick here, top 10 sources of calories of low-income individuals in the US. And of course, the top one here is sugary drinks. And it goes down, you know, lots of, again, high-fat, low-fiber foods. And then that intersection with gender and socioeconomic status. So we know that women experience more food insecurity than men on a global basis. And of course, this is prevalent in low-income countries, but it's also something we see in Canada. This is some statistics data, statistics data on food insecurity in Canada. And you'll note that it's the lone parent households. These are mainly headed by women who experience the most moderate and even severe food insecurity. So we can bring this all back to thinking about these issues around gender and first 1,000 days and food insecurity, and think about this within the context of the developmental origins of health and disease. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with this framework, but just as a reminder, this was pioneering research done in the 1980s by David Barker, an epidemiologist in the UK. And basically a short summary of it is that what happens in utero and the exposures, environmental exposures to the fetus in utero, toxins and food, of course, is important, and even stress as well. These have profound effects that epigenetically change the metabolism of the fetus and affect the risk of adult onset of non-communicable diseases, things like diabetes, cardiovascular disease later in life. And I'm going to take one step further here, some research that is very controversial still, but I just want to talk about a little bit in terms of thinking about DOHAD, is that the maternal gut microbiome may even modulate early life development. And I know we're pretty sure, although there's, again, questioning of this, that the gut is sterile at birth, but there is some research showing that there may actually be some colonization of the fetal gut during pregnancy, and if that's so, that it means there's even a more profound need to think about maternal diets and the effect of offspring. So at McMaster, I'm working with my colleague, Dr. Deb Sloboda, and she does the mouse research, and she has been looking at high-fat diets during pregnancy on both the maternal and offspring microbiota, and she's using these models to see whether we can think about this for humans as well. And my part as an anthropologist and social scientist in this project is looking at the translation of knowledge about maternal diet, the microbiome, and the prevention of non-communicable diseases to public health workers and to pregnant people and their families as well. And so currently we're doing a survey of pregnant women in Hamilton. We're looking at knowledge of pregnancy nutrition, barriers and facilitators of healthy pregnancy diet, among other variables. We're also collecting dietary data as well for these women. And then the qualitative piece of this is the focus group interviews that we're doing with pregnant women, their partners, their supports, midwives, physicians, public health nurses and dietitians, and early childhood educators. And we're still analyzing this data, but some really important preliminary results are coming out about food insecurity as being a very big problem, a huge barrier to a high-quality pregnancy diet, as well as mental health challenges that many of women have talked about that also hamper their ability to eat healthy food during pregnancy. So in conclusion, we have adapted and we continue to adapt to these changing diets. A part of that is that host-microbe symbiosis, which gives us some of that flexibility. The industrial diet, though, I think is really our greatest challenge to date, and we really need to think about the profound change on the human diet and the microbiome. But I would just ask us to remember the fact that diet is so much affected by gender, poverty, racism, and food insecurity really has to be a focus in this type of intervention to prevent transgenerational transmission of NCDs. Okay, thank you so much, and to my colleagues as well at McMaster University, and to the organizers again.